what we get awe-inspired by tells us, like, this is what I really care about. And this is what I want to be part of in the story of my life. And that's why awe is here, is to locate us in the grand narratives of existence.
Welcome to the first episode of the second series of the Examined Life podcast. Today I'm joined by my good friend Ian Porter. We're talking to the psychologist Dacher Keltner about the question that he thinks we should be asking ourselves. Dacher is a professor of psychology at UCLA Berkley, where he teaches about happiness and studies the emotion of awe, something he's also written a very good book about. This conversation I found really uplifting and inspiring and actually really important. A theme that kind of runs through these conversations in the second series is what it means to be positively maladjusted to a sick society. How we find what is of value in life and live in better alignment to it. And in that respect, I found Dacher's discussion of awe and meaning really important and illuminating, and I hope that you might too. Please do like, subscribe, share this with others who you think might enjoy it. There's a newsletter, I'd love you to sign up for it. It's where I process my musings as well as tell you what's coming up and a bit of a backstory to each episode. I do hope you enjoy this. We're going to begin with a question I ask all guests at the start, and that's, what question is it we should be asking ourselves?
Yeah, I think the question that I've really been intrigued with for 20 years in my science and then in my teaching is how does the individual find the meaningful life? You know, in the science of happiness, we differentiate between sensory pleasures. You have a wonderful meal and you feel good. And then, social relationships and all the delights that those bring. And then more recently, in the last 5 years, there's been this interest in something that's a little bit, I don't want to say deeper, but more complicated, which is meaning, right? Which is what really matters to me, what really brings whatever I'm doing in my life purpose, and then how does it fit in a kind of a larger narrative of life, right? And so I have been just thinking about and seeking to study and bring to our public discourse how we find meaning in life.
Okay, how do we find meaning in life? And that sounds like a kind of researcher's me-search type question. Is it something you've been drawn towards personally as well as like a professional academic interest in it?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at happiness and this vast scientific terrain and inquiry across all kinds of different disciplines. We've been thinking about what makes us happy for a long time. And you can find the people who love delight and aesthetic pleasure and sensory pleasure, right? You can find the people who really thrive in, achievement or success, and you find people who love social relationships. And then there's this little kind of individual that really is intrigued by meaning and obsessed with meaning. And I'm one of those people, I love good food and I love relationships and but I've always, since I was a little kid, what's the whole point of this, and that turns out to be a big question in this new literature on well-being. And for me personally, it was really, I grew up without religion. I grew up in a very almost countercultural type of context, raised by kind of activist parents, artists, and my mom taught literature. And they were really like, it's great to feel pleasure. It's great to have the most wonderful relationships, but really always be wondering what's the point of your life. And so it is indeed, I'm embarrassed to say, a personal inquiry as well.
I ask there's so much I'd like to go into, and I'm 100% with you in terms of this is the kind of the question that animates me. What does it mean to have a meaningful life? But I suppose we could have meaning with a big M, like there is a meaning to life and we're to discover it, or the kind of slightly more postmodern meaning is something we create in our lives. Are you approaching it kind of from both or one angle, or?
Yeah, I think both are true, right? I think that, in some sense, evolution and the history of life on Earth has brought to the human species realms of meaning that we can find our purpose in, right? Our relationship to the natural world is a fundamental source of almost spiritual meaning for humans around the world. Our relationship to music, our relationship to visual art, our relationship to morality and the moral beauty of other people, and awe, right? Those things are realms that have been crafted or shaped by evolution that we find in our lived lives that bring us meaning. And then at the same time, so much of it is constructed in cultures and individuals, given our family histories and our political moment in history, where I am a child, as a personal example, of the late '60s, raised in a radical place, Laurel Canyon, by two early counterculture parents, and I had given that history in that moment and what they taught me in the words and the concepts. I had to find meaning in art and in forms of activism and going into prisons to see what is the human character. So it's both are true, and that's what's I really shy away from these Manichaean debates. It's either constructed or it's biological. Both are rich and true, and and inform us how we can find what matters to us.
Like, do you think this question? Um, so I've become aware of various people, John Vervaeke or Jonathan Rowson, talking about a meaning crisis. We're in a kind
Yeah.
of crisis of meaning at the moment.
Oh my
Does
God.
that kind of occur to you as well? Is that
Oh, if you just take the United States and perhaps the UK and Western Europe look like this, uh, you know, just historic rises. And I teach young people, right, who are on their quest for meaning. I've taught them for 33 years. I have 660 Berkeley students in my happiness class, really pursuing what is meaningful to them. And there are all these forces that have led to a meaning crisis, right? The de-churching of young people. They're moving away from ritual and dogma, if you will, for a lot of good reasons, but they don't have that. The breakdown of intergenerational contact and community. The I think one of the real shortcomings of the new technologies, the smartphones and digital platforms, is they're flat. They are flat temporally. They only engage us in the present moment, self-focus, where we've lost sight of the deeper meaning to our lives. And as a result, the meaning crisis is real. In the United States, the opioid crisis is a crisis of meaning, and that's one of the central killers of young people today. The suicide crisis, which is at historic highs for young people, is a crisis of meaning. Depression, historic highs in the United States, is a crisis of meaning. Polarization, like why uh, a person would look at Trump and think like this guy is a reasonable steward of a democracy. That's a crisis of meaning, right? We've lost the big narratives of our lives, and we've lost our pathway to what we find meaningful. And it's interesting, just to like the crisis of in America. People are no longer enrolling in courses of the humanities, literature, history, visual art history. We don't, I asked my undergrads today, like, why would the Holocaust have ever occurred? And they're like, remind me of what that is, So we have a lot of work to do to restore meaning.
here too? The humanities are declining, and as our cultures become, I think, more technological, it's not an accident. It's not just like the hand of society. It's actually transforming the way that we interact with the world and attend to it.
Yeah,
Um, but as it's become more instrumental and utilitarian as a way of
exactly.
kind of looking at life, it's stripped us of the relationships that we did have
Yeah.
with the natural world, with one another, with meaningful work, and so on. And as you say, that question has sharp teeth. Like, where do I find meaning when that's all gone? How do I kind of find my way back?
Yeah, I really feel we're at this apex of the crisis of individualism in some sense. And there are remarkable strengths to the historic rise of individualism, beginning some would say in the age of enlightenment. Individual rights, the freedoms we have to think what we want, to feel what we want, to have the identity that we would like to, that feels right. And it's a remarkable development in human history. And at the same time, it has separated us from people and from the natural world. It has built into us, thank you for, a utilitarian, instrumental, transactional view of life, of, it's all fungible. We can buy it and trade it, and it has blinded us to these deep truths, like we're all part of this interconnected social system and ecosystem, that there are things that you can't buy, and that we are also collective, and not separate from each other in profound ways that science is showing. So I hope I hope these meaning crises will get us back to some of those complementary truths to who we are, that we're collective, we're storytellers. There are things that are sacred. The idea that, I think, in the academy, we challenge the idea, oh, the sacred is just constructed. But no, there are pretty deep things that are sacred around the world. And I think we need to remind ourselves of these deep tendencies we have.
I've heard voices like yours, but there are other ones
Yeah.
too. Whether you're talking about, I suppose, Michael Sandel and the morality of markets, or what the Harvard Flourishing Project has come out with, the good life thing. They're like science catching up with grandma, right? These are things
Yeah.
that generations ago you were told, yeah, you need to kind of be part of ritual, part of collective society, part of,
Yeah.
there's intrinsic worth to things that you don't have a price tag on. And now people like yourself are discovering the kind of neurophysiology of why that
Yeah.
works out.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff is old, like, finding your meaning in music, which people do around the world. That's old. I mean, that's music is 80,000 years old. The archaeological record suggests we sing similar songs around the world to our children. That's old. Finding meaning in visual patterns and in spiritual tendencies, all deep human universals that are old. But we've lost sight of them, in this individualistic, globalized world. We don't practice the rituals. We don't listen to music intentionally. We really are deeply disconnected from nature, which is remarkable. And when you think about what we were like a couple, 300-400 years ago, yeah. So I am proud to be the scientist who says Grandma was right. Uh, and by the way, so were those indigenous peoples around the world. They've been writing about meaning and transcendence and a different sense of self and consciousness. People like Dr. Urias Salidwin. So, they're that in part science reminds us of the enduring truths, the perennial truths. But I will say, the neurophysiology really matters, right? That awe, as one example, shuts down parts of the brain that are associated with rumination and self-focus, activates the vagus nerve and branches of your immune system that are healthy, right? So that's important knowledge for us today as we confront this crisis of meaning.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'd love to dig into that in a
Yeah.
second. I think, Ian, did you have a question? I feel like you had a question on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just curious, are there then universal elements of meaning to us all, or is there a universal like balance to be found that almost, I think Kenny alluded to it earlier, a sort of a fundamental truth that we should all be sort of seeking, or is it going to be different for everybody? How would you characterize it?
Only the hardest question in the entire social
Yeah,
sciences,
sorry.
outside of, and next is, what is consciousness? So thank you. Yeah, I've struggled with this one for 25 years. And, you take meaning, my sense is evolution, our hominid evolution, this incredible symbolic brain that we have that's evolving, gives us kind of the structures that are universal, right? So we are a storytelling species, and that's how we understand things. It emerged linguists think with, when we started to gather and around fires and cook meat and build tools in and represent our natural world in stories. And that's a structure to meaning of like, where am I in this story of my culture, my family, my identity, my people? And that is a human universal, right? And then the structure, and then there are people who have looked at the content of stories, people looking at folklore and the like, who say, there are 26, 30 universal human themes that make their way into stories, right? Revenge and injustice and murder and family dynamics and power and generosity and saintliness. And I think that those will be universal. Susan Langer, the great music philosopher, incredible thinking about what she wrote about significant life themes that make their way into the musics around the world, right? Of I'm falling in love, I'm connecting to the divine, I am grappling with war and death. Those are universals. But then, God, it varies so much around the world about what you think death is, where you think you go, what you consider to be, a family structure. And so I think both are always at play in, again, this great dynamic of what evolution gives us and it's universal, and then what culture does to transform it in mysterious ways. So, it's so that's always the social scientist says both are true.
Yeah, yeah.
Apologize.
So you mentioned awe as
Yeah.
like one of the kind of, I suppose, scientific. You made a scientific study of awe, lenses through which you understand meaning. Can you say a bit more about that? Like, so you've got a definition of awe. You've got the kind of the wonders of awe in your great new book. I wonder if I could hand it to you to explain what you mean by awe.
Yeah, I've been studying the kind of transcendent emotions for some time in my career that, Darwin wrote about, the field ignored, a lot of inquiry into them right now. And they, the moral emotions, as Jonathan Haidt has said, very rightly so. And they're incredible, right? Compassion is just the emotion that gets you to take care of harm. And that's a deep human need and universal. Gratitude is where you like recognize how you're connected to friends and in trading relationships and giving to each other. And then I stumbled into the study of awe, which, this incredible emotion that we feel when we encounter vast mysteries we don't understand. And it's so striking. We have an emotion that's about mystery, and that animates us to figure mysteries out. We can chart the physiology of awe that helps define it, you know, deactivates the default mode network in the brain, which is part of self ego representation, produces tears, which are part of the parasympathetic nervous system's opening of the body to other people, elevates the activation of the vagus nerve, gives you those goosebumps and chills, which are incredible, pretty universal, right? So awe has these sensations, this meaning to it. And as you said, Kenny, we feel it in response to, in some sense, what like Einstein said, like, what is just the most human stuff of existence? Art, music, spirituality, moral beauty of other people, moving with others, big ideas, life and death, right? These wonders of life that I write about in this book, awe, that are universal sources of awe. And then to the theme of our conversation, I was like, our lab was grappling with like, what's the point of awe? Why? And one thing it does is it really makes us better citizens of communities. We share, we cooperate. If you go out and you look at the sky for a minute or two and take in a sunset or these wonderful trees nearby on the Berkeley campus and elsewhere, it makes you share and cooperate. And like, but what it really does for the mind is it tells you what is most meaningful to you, right? It says to you, what we get an awe inspired by tells us like, this is what I really care about. And this is what I want to be part of in the story of my life. And that's why awe is here, is to locate us in the grand narratives of existence.
And that's like it's such a like uplifting thing to study and to
Yeah,
have as
yeah,
part of our physiology. It's kind of um oh well, I mean, yeah, it's human beings in their element, being kind of the most human, like fish and water. But I
well put.
I wonder if as you say, it kind of reveals what you value, and often
Yeah,
it kind of reverses what you value.
yeah,
So if you have this hierarchy, and often like the instrumental, the utilitarian, and pleasure tend to be at the top, and these days in our culture, like the sacred and the holy is pretty low down. And that is kind of, and interconnectedness is right there at the top, and connection to maybe to divine, to nature, and so on at the top when you have awe experiences. I wonder, and like you've got the evolutionary kind of
yeah,
pragmatic function,
yeah.
but is it also a compass for truth in some sense?
Mm,
Like it's true that we're interconnected. It's true that you know the it, the sense you have in experiencing awe is you're
mm.
resonating with something that is just true in the fabric of the universe and being human and
God,
so on. But maybe I'm uh, imposing something too grand on this visual. I don't know. What's your response to that?
God, Kenny, I mean, of all the conversations I've had about awe, that's the first time somebody's raised that possibility. It's such a great idea. Thank you. Compass for truth. And certainly, William James, when he was writing about religious awe or mystical awe, and, a lot of the new interest in psychedelics builds upon James's discoveries that
Mm.
a core piece to a spiritual experience, be it meditating or in a spiritual contemplative context or psychedelics, is what James called the noetic dimension to that experience. Like, this is true. I know this is a fundamental quality of reality, and I think you're right. But I'll just complicate things a little bit, which is that and again, borrowing from your wonderful summary, which is, I think that evolution built into us very sensibly a lot of mechanisms that are about self-interest and self-preservation. Do I get rewards here? Am I gaining strategic advantage? Do I have elevated status compared to my friends? So I have more reproductive opportunities, right? That's self-interest, utilitarianism at its raw foundation. But we became this collective species, which needed us to recognize those truths too, that we are part of a collective, we are part of a culture, we share things with other people. I have a collective sense of self. And that's what I think awe makes us realize. And we've lost sight of this, that there are these truths like, I have a collective mind. My physiology is linked up with other people all the time, right? We all share in this shared consciousness that culture gives us. And so, is awe a compass for truth? I think it's a compass that shines a light on these truths of our collective consciousness. So it's a little bit constrained.
That's absolutely fair and very very scientific. Uh, I
Sorry, I was hoping I could go to your lofty reaches, but next time.
well, I am. I've like any excuse to try and find a, a north star for kind of life. I was looking at James's varieties religious experience, and it seems like awe is like. So he's talking about religious awe, but it maps onto the others: passive,
Yeah,
transient, ineffable. Um,
yeah.
they just kind of resonate. What your I mentioned this in the email, I think. What your insights and your work really seem to chime with to me is Ian McGilchrist's work on how let the right hemisphere attend to the world. Are you kind of familiar with that? And is it something that you'd recognize?
Yeah, I know that hemispheric, symmetrical division of labor in the mind. Richie Davidson worked on it for a long time. I don't know what the status of it is, and I know McGilchrist's arguments, and I think he's onto something, and that's the kind of insight we need in this search for these higher order forms of meaning in the psychedelic literature, where the truths, you believe in panpsychism and collective consciousness, right? And that's I think there's going to be, I think that's going to be verified, if you will, in the study of psychedelics and awe is there are big chunks of the brain that give you oceanic feelings of connectivity, like the oxytocin network in the periaqueductal gray and other regions. There are chunks of your cortex that represent, and other regions of the brain that represent, like, wow, I no longer feel like there are these boundaries between me and other people. We're all part of some organism, right? And those are fundamental truths. Whether it's in the right versus left hemisphere, that's a controversial thesis that really grouchy neuroscientists probably wouldn't endorse. But but I think McGilchrist is right in spirit, and I think that's one of the great frontiers of inquiry is this oceanic brain that emerges with awe and psychedelics and dance and music and meditation, and we just don't know what those regions are. And great theorists like McGilchrist point us. They say, "Go get them." He may be wrong whether it's right or left hemisphere, but I think he's right in the claim.
Yeah, in terms of it changes the kind of attention you pay to the world. If you have
Oh my
the
God.
kind of his left hemisphere's utilitarian instrumentalist, doesn't get context, doesn't get relationships, but the awe, man, it's front and center for all of that interconnection and communing with the divine and so on.
So is it too simplistic to just map sort of individualistic utilitarian thoughts to the left of the brain and awe to the right? Is there sort of evidence in support of that? It sounds very a lovely model. It's easy for everyone to understand, but
Yeah, I think there's a whole, I'm always in the science world, and there are deep skepticisms about right left hemisphere. I mean, those are massive chunks of the brain, right? 40 billion neurons in each side. So we got to have more specificity. But I think an ambitious, provocative young neuroscientist could probably show that's the case. That you know utilitarian, narrow self-interest, reward-driven behavior probably is in the left parts of the cortex. More oceanic, hyper-connected stuff is in the right. And you need the right tasks and measures, but that would really shake the field up. And I think there's plausibility to it. So
It's a very interesting frontier of science, huh?
yeah, I agree.
Um, uh, would you say that? So we talked briefly, really, about how maybe individualism, kind of maybe since Reformation, Enlightenment, we have
Yep.
perhaps decreased our exposure to experiences of awe. Would you say that we are more awe deprived than we were before, and this is perhaps connected to the meaning crisis, if I can bring it back around to that? So I guess two questions there is,
Yeah.
do you see
Wow.
us as more awe deprived, and like what are the
Yeah.
hallmarks of that? And yeah, is that connected to this meaning crisis that you see in the opium crisis,
Mhm.
suicide crisis, and so on?
What a terrific question. Yeah, in some sense, the you know the understanding is that 400 or 500 years ago, we lived in these communities. They were tighter. We weren't traveling. There were smaller communities organized by religion and rituals and social practices, and there was a lot of that deep shared awe, right? There are a lot of downsides, obviously, to community life, and we have to remember they're usually not very good for women, and often, that kind of community life. There are often pretty rigid hierarchies and dogmas and the like. And we've had this sort of move away from that to our individualistic era, and I think so. In some sense, what we yearn for are those structures, and Alain de Botton and Boyer and Casper ter Kuile coming out of Harvard Divinity School, and others are saying, like, let's return to our lives the strengths of community that aren't necessarily judgmental or sexist or patriarchal, right? Of rituals and music and shared eating and narrative. So and opportunities for awe. Um, the data are clear, which I referred to, that says we are awe deprived. That young people really not they don't 40% of Americans don't have a role model who inspires them, which is just so, we need those people. We are not getting out in nature like we used to get out in nature. So that's worrisome. We listen to music much more differently than we did 100 years ago or 40 years ago when I was young. We don't listen to it together. We listen to it in a fragmented way. So we've lost a lot of opportunities for awe. Education has become so narrow. It's amazing what young people learn. It's better than at any time in human history, but they don't step back and think of the broader context, and that's well documented. So we've lost a lot, and I think it's why we hunger for meaning, and why you see things in young people today, because this is irrepressible. They're interested in communal living. They're challenging the institution of marriage, right? They are interested in various green movements. So they're interested in festivals. Festivals are at historic highs because they provide awe. So it's very much at play with this crisis of meaning, is our need for awe and where we can find it.
That's a fascinating connection between festivals and kind of awe deprivation. I'd never
Ah,
thought of that connection before. But yeah, I absolutely see it. I mean, one thing that comes to mind, Alain de Botton and Casper Toulet and people like that who are trying to construct kind of, I suppose, containers for meaning, but without the metaphysics that came before from religion.
yeah,
And sometimes I wonder if that's like how possible that is to
yeah.
have the fruits without the roots, as it were. I mean, maybe it is, and they could kind of.
I think I think I think Kenny, you're right to question that. There's a wonderful essay by Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker on Robert Wright's book on Buddhism,
Hmm.
where he's like, Robert Wright, who's a great writer, kind of secularizes Buddhism, and he takes out all the metaphysics, of afterlives and multiple selves and transcending time and so forth. And humans love that, so why not allow for that as well? And I think awe leads us in that direction. It led William James to it, right? And so I think you're right to suggest we need that.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I think the fact that I know the end of your book, you've got, what is all for? It brings us together collectively. It's got kind of phenomenological coherence um, and reveals the systems that we're part of. It brings to mind, I suppose, my kind of trading in kind of philosophy and theology. Uh,
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis has this kind of argument. He says we're born with these desires, the
Mm.
for hunger, for sex, for community, and so on. And there's something to meet them. But that hunger for meaning, he said, well, it means we're wired for the divine, or whatever. And it's I don't know, when you unweave the rainbow or kind of disenchant the world, um, how you find re-enchantment, um, is feels like a big question.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why I love William James so much.
Mm,
Pluralism, it is a big question, and C.S. Lewis is right. We secular, rational, ethics type people struggle with our urge for the divine, but it is as universal as any social tendency, right? People do it. 81% of Americans believe in the divine, and so it's there. Um, and I agree. I think that we need multiple conversations to allow people to approach that question. As a reductionistic scientist, when I got into the sort of my own narrative of awe, in particular in losing my brother who passed away, and wondered, what is his life? Like, what is his consciousness when his body goes? Classic question. And I still felt him around, and I had these supernatural experiences. I felt his hand on my back a couple times. I heard his voice. Uh, I sense him around, and so then as a scientist, as like me, you or a secular person, you shift to a different layers of meaning, like quantum physics and the quantum self, and
mm,
and that's part of this inquiry. our hunger for deeper meaning, that I think we need to encourage, whatever the pathway.
I find that very moving reading about your brother Rolf and
Thank you.
your experience of all there.
Mm, thanks.
Um, I so you mentioned education, and I kind of agree. I'm in it, maybe in a different sense in awe
Yeah.
of, kind of what young people are learning. There's so
Yeah.
much, but it does feel like there is very little actual awe in a school curriculum now.
Yeah.
Um, and I wonder if you could do two things. Maybe say what good it would do if all was part of education, and
Yeah.
like whether you've got any idea of what that might look like. I would love to be part of a curriculum which tried to engender a sense of awe.
Yeah. I uh, I think it's a central challenge of our times. There are economists. There's something called the Flynn effect, which is people are getting smarter. In sort of the kind of the rational, utilitarian, scientific method. They're better at data. They're better at statistics. They know genetics. They know the brain. They know ecosystems. They can. It's amazing what people know, and young people know. Um, and at the same time, I think it's, as you referred to earlier, Kenny, it's become really narrow uh, and process oriented and reductionistic. Like, oh, I figure out algorithms to, where input turns into output, and I know the answer. And what they've lost is broadly a sense of mystery, and then the bigger questions that are accompanied by awe, right? And it's interesting, if in writing this book and just look and reading people's lives, uh, most of the great discoveries in human history are accompanied by experiences of awe. Religious discoveries, Darwin's discoveries of evolution, Einstein, etc. It is as we've called it in our lab, an epistemological emotion that drives knowledge forward, and our students have lost that. And so we've actually created a course that brings more awe into schools, targeting like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and you just return to the big questions, right? And remind students, whatever they're studying, like, what is the system that what you're learning about is part of? You might be learning baseball, soccer, like football statistics in the UK. Well, what is the system of football in the UK? And think about its history. What are the origins of the phenomena that you're considering? This comes out of Rachel Carson, which is you're studying a little piece of a domain of knowledge, right? You're studying this moment in British history. Well, let's broaden out and think about the broader forces and patterns it's part of. And I think there are simple ways to get to McGilchrist's, like, let's shift brain and think about the broader context of things to get students to reactivate awe. So let's cross our fingers. I think we really need it.
Yeah, 100%.
What would you do?
No, well, I mean, I get if I could, and I try to do this with some of my students, just get them into nature as much as possible,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
understanding that they are part of nature. So we even our language suggests that we're distinct from it, right? We talk about going into nature as if we're a being apart from it. So I think getting into nature feels to me like fundamental. Um,
fundamental.
Learning to learning to listen to each other better. We're bad at that, and what comes is a kind of lack of connection.
Yeah.
Uh, oh, I mean, it's a good question. I should have asked myself it already.
No, well, you've
What
hit two
about
on the head, right? Nature-based education, listening.
I mean, those feel not feeling like you're part of a machine, like
Yeah.
you're a
Yeah.
sausage factory of like here's some. The questions and the mystery should be more interesting than the answers and more rewarding. So I suppose that being kind of front and center. And as you say, like I love the idea of zooming out so you have a context and you feel like you're part of something vast. Those are all ways of yeah, sparking awe. I think
And
listening. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
yeah, I love your emphases, and it's worth just dwelling upon it for a minute. Nature, listening, but the word that kept just stayed with me through writing this book is mystery,
Hmm.
and it's so relevant to knowledge and education. Our topic right now, the so much is animated by mystery, and it is the great fount of discovery, and awe is the emotion around mystery, and are watching my daughters go through such an intense education these days that they lost the mystery,
Hmm.
of biology or economic history or whatever it is, or mathematics. And I think you're right. That could be a whole movement of mystery based education.
I mean, I think McGilchrist, if he was here, would be like chiming in with this because it's when we remove things from their context, like looking at a cell in isolation under a microscope without this, because actually fundamentally you're looking at a different thing because you're not looking at what it's part of and the way it's interconnected. It ceases to be what it is when it's torn from where, from its context. Um,
Great connection.
yeah.
Practices like the modern well-being practices like meditation and gratitude, journaling, how do they relate to awe? Because it seems like you mystery is about curiosity, and journaling allows you to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture. And you mentioned, I think, at the start of the conversation, awe has a way of turning the rumination side of the brain off, and meditation seems like it maybe does that too. So are there practices that relate to developing a sense of awe, or an openness to awe?
Thank you, Ian. The one of the it's so interesting how blind scientists are, and people who study things. Like, we should have answers to your question. What is the relationship between meditation, 2,500 years old, 3,000 years old, yoga is older, and awe? I mean, so much of it is a way to become awestruck by our natural worlds, the world around us, humans, life and death. Bhutanese practices get you to imagine the life cycle, in the Himalayan Buddhism tradition, and we just don't know. And I think it's going to be one of the big areas of discovery in the study of mindfulness, is that there are practices that can bring about awe and through mindfulness that are good for us. Things like this Bhutanese practice that is being tested now, of just taking people you love and imagining their life cycle from being an infant to passing away, and people feel more awe at the wonders of the life cycle, and actually feel more connected to the world. Nature immersion meditation is a medication, and that's coming in a big way. That we have evolved tendencies to feel contemplative in nature. And one thing I'm really interested in that we totally forget, it's ridiculous. I've been teaching mindfulness stuff for 20 years in my class, like focus on your body, feel your breath, imagine you're eating a raisin. That's all good. But we forgot music
Mm.
and visual art. Like, listen to music and see what your identity is revealed. So there are a lot of techniques to bring about awe, and we've tested them scientifically. They're great for people, and I think they're a future of that literature.
Is your experience that so if you talk about mind like a mindful mindset and you can talk about a mindset that's maybe primed for awe,
Yeah.
did you in your studies when you looked at the physiology, did you notice it more in younger children? Is it something they kind of they unlearn as they get older?
Man, your question just gave me goosebumps. Because which goosebumps, the physiological correlate of awe, arises when we feel like we're sharing something. You and I are sharing something that's really important. That idea. Yeah, it's so funny. Um, and again, this is how scientists are extraordinarily blind. Um, the for a long time, people felt like you couldn't measure awe, you couldn't study it, it's the ineffable, it's mysterious. You can measure awe in several different ways. There's an awe vocalization. Whoa, it's deeply universal. So you can measure it, you can study it. And there are like 2 papers on awe in children, which is astonishing. We've done one, and then another lab at the University of Chicago is working on it. And there is the possibility, and we're starting to study infant baby awe, that it is one of the early emerging emotions, right? Maybe at a year where, and if you want proof, like there are these funny YouTube videos of babies in tunnels where a little baby in a car seat will they go into a tunnel and they're in pitch black and existence has stopped and they're dead in their early minds. And then they come out of the tunnel and it's bright and there's mom, and she's driving.
Wow,
and you look at their facial, you got to see them. And their facial expressions are pure awe. They're just like, whoa. So, we now have the capacity to figure out, like, maybe, like the Buddhists and Einstein are right. Like, awe is a basic state of consciousness. Basic. Wow, that's something vast that I can't make sense of. There it is. And maybe we unlearn it through life. And that's what Rachel Carson, who's a hero in this book, the great American environmentalist, said, awe, it is our signature strength, and it is an antidote to how civilization can crush us as we grow older, and an important reminder to return to it.
Yeah, maybe one of the reasons is because you're educated out of it. Like everything's flattened and reduced, and there are no miracles, no mysteries, no enchantment here. And there's no wonder that you end up an adult until you have kids, right? You've got chapter in kind of birth and death, and me and Ian both have kids, and there is that that initial experience, but also that kind of continuous experience as they're growing up and wide-eyed, and those. It's a good
and you just highlight, it's so fascinating, and you guys are asking good questions. I wish I had better answers, but I knew I could study awe, and I was lost in the worlds of compassion and gratitude and other emotions, and then my first daughter Natalie was born 26 years ago, and just watching her come out, looking at her face, and I write about this in the book, and I study the face, and I was like, God, her face looks like the perfect mixture of Molly and my faces and generations of faces. I was just like, the whole world was new, right? And then we find that as a universal elicitor of awe. But the deeper, unexamined question, Kenny, you point to is how parenting and the child, as we coexist through life, is just a perpetual source. It's a source of horror and disgust as they vomit on you, and terror and so forth. But awe, there is so much awe in watching children develop it, and no one studied that. And there should be awe-based parenting to come.
Yeah, I think it's so. I did a bit of a study the other year on presence, actually, as a virtue, like becoming present to the moment, and it feels like that's awe makes you present, makes you kind of savoring, absorbing the moment. Maybe it's also a condition of awe. If I go to see my daughter in the Christmas show, which I will do in a week or two, and I'm like checking my phone, and not being present, I'm going to miss it. But I think one of my favorite takeaways from your book is awe is always at arm's reach, within our, what am I trying to say? Within arm's reach, within arm's length. It's available to us. But you need to be kind of primed for it or attentive to it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for bringing that into our collective awareness. This is why we do science. A lot of it confirms what your grandmother would have told you. And maybe your grandmother would have said this too, that awe is always around us.
She would never have said that, to be honest.
No.
I did now and again catch her feeling awe. And interestingly, as she's gotten older, that's come back to her. You know how old people kind of become a bit more like kids in one
Yeah.
sense? She is more, like she will well up much quicker. Anyway, we're not talking about my grandmother.
I want to talk about your grandmother.
Yeah, she's 99, all right? And so
Oh,
she's feeling these things. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
carry
but
on.
no, but this is why we do science. And I think when people hear the word awe, they think, oh, it's that extraordinary moment, where I'm at Stonehenge and the storm goes past and a lightning bolt hits and I hear the voice of God, and and it's once in a lifetime. But awe, our research shows in 10 different cultures, we feel it 2 to 3 times a week, and we can feel it every day. It's at arm's reach, it's around us. And when you think about the implications, it's a basic state of mind, right? If we just pause for a minute, put stuff away. And we recently tested this and published it, and it's not in the book because it wasn't yet published. But we had medical doctors, nurses during the height of the pandemic in the United States, and it was chaos. And they were watching people die without family around, and understaffed and overworked. These are really people in the hardest times of medical care. And we had them do an awe awareness where it's just like 1 minute a day, you stop, put stuff away, you take some breathing, you put aside your kind of labels and checklists, and then you just think like, what's a big thing I'm part of right now, you
Hmm.
know and when I look at you and Ian, I'm like, man, these guys have asked such incredible questions. We're part of this broader conversation about awe and meaning. So we did that with healthcare providers. Just be aware of it for 1 minute. And then for the next 21 days, they did that, and they were less depressed and anxious during the pandemic, significantly so. So yeah, it's around us, and a lot of things are conspiring, like we've talked about in this show, to make us forget that. Oh, what's your next goal? What's on your smartphone? Who's at the great resort on your Instagram, and why do I envy them? And awe's right here. And
It's so pernicious, isn't it? The way that the technology, particularly screens, leach into everything. I'm a
yeah.
big fan of Shabbat. I don't keep it really, but Abraham Joshua Heschel says that it's like building a palace in time, and is this time
Mm,
without technology, without work, where you're just kind of dwelling, abiding, I suppose.
wow.
And it's those kind of ancient practices that have carried communities through, and maybe they
Mm,
partly carried communities through because they've created that space for awe, for kind of appreciation.
palaces in time. And there's a wonderful book, Palaces for the People, in the United States, by a sociologist, about our public spaces,
Hmm.
that really are really meant to be public spaces for awe. And galleries and museums and concert halls and squares and natural history museums. And one of the really fun things to grow out of awe is, now I'm part of conversations with museums and art museums, like, how do we bring a little bit of awe back?
Hmm.
Rather than, I was in the Louvre recently, and I was like mud wrestling with 80,000 tourists just to take a selfie in front of the Mona Lisa, and that was the experience of the Louvre. And I'm like, come on, it's got to be better than that. And so I think I love your thought there, Kenny, of like, what are our palaces of time and sacredness that awe is part of?
I almost wonder, is it almost like awe is our default state, and that it's, I think it's called automaticity. When you learn how to do something, you develop a model in your mind, and then you fit everything that you can to that model, and then you stop thinking about the model, and so you just
Mm,
stop being awestruck by those
mm,
things that once were novel but are now automated. Um, does novelty factor into alongside vastness and mystery, or is it part of the mystery? Is that where it factors in? It seems like novel things are more. If I see an amazing mountain vista once, it's awe-inspiring. If I see it 20 times, I'm really going to have to sort of meditate on it and focus and use those tools to try and bring back that sense.
Yeah, man, you asked again two of the harder questions in this space. The first is, and this again is why we do science, default state. You know, a lot of Western European people will be like, no, awe is just a luxury. It's a construct of culture. It isn't part of our natural state, if you will. They would even contest the idea of a natural state. And although, people in the contemplative traditions, like, the different branches of Buddhism are very interested in natural states. And I think awe is a natural state of the human mind, as is compassion. And this is why science is really interesting, because compassion, we know, engages parts of the brain that are in the midbrain, very old regions of the brain, right? It isn't cortical. It isn't just a construct of culture. It is just an old natural state. When we encounter harm, we feel compassion. And the evidence is emerging as well for awe, which is it engages old regions of the brain, oxytocin networks, vagal tone, very old system in the mammalian nervous system, that says this is a natural state of responding to vast mystery, which mammals do. Jane Goodall really felt that the chimpanzees she observed felt awe, as I write about in the book. Novelty, and this is where I really find inspiration from the contemplative traditions, beginner's mind, right? You can always feel things are new, because in some sense, they are.
Yeah.
Beginner's mind, that was absolutely just recurring to me for the last 10 minutes. I feel like this is where we're going to go. I wonder if I'm aware that you're at the beginning of a day and the beginning of a week. I wonder if I can just try and pull some threads together and ask you one last question, if that's all right.
Okay, sure.
So the question, am I phrasing it right? How do we find meaning in life? Is that,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, carry on. Did you phrase it differently? Was it how do we find meaning?
Yeah. How do you find meaning in life? How do you know the things you do matter, that they're part of a larger story that you understand? And my answer is awe. It is the emotion that connects most deeply to our quest for meaning. And so what I do, and I really learned, through grief in losing my brother, where I felt like life was meaningless, because he was such a source of meaning for me throughout, since he was born 14 months after I was born, is, like we talked about earlier, cultivate an awe mindset, pause, open your mind, put away labels and conceptualizations, and think about the things that are bigger that you're part of, and then rely on those 8 wonders to find meaning. Moral beauty, people's kindness and courage, that will give you a lot of meaning, who those people are. Music, young people find so much meaning in music, and we forget that, right? Visual design, moving with others, spiritual, ethical contemplation. So the wonders of life, which are very intuitive and around us, get us to meaning if we just pause for a moment and open our minds.
I love it. That's so kind of beautifully practical and incredibly profound. And yeah, I'm going to try and be deliberate about creating those palaces in time for all to fill them.
Awesome.
Dacher, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real joy to speak to you.
Kenny and Ian, I am scribbling notes over here because I've got lots of new ideas to pursue, thanks to you. And thank you for getting us all to think about the examined life. We need more of it.
Not at all. I mean, there's so many other places I'd love to go, but time is what it is.
It is.
I hope you have a wonderful Monday, and thanks so much for joining us today.
It's been uplifting to be with you guys. Thank you.
Cool.